was just Srila Prabhupada was was not a native speaker of English. English was a second language for him. Scoot over a little bit, Bob. English was a second language for him. And Hector, scoot over that this way. Good. And that's, that creates some challenges. If you don't speak another language, then you don't understand. And so there's no real way to explain it to you. But there are things in philosophy which are called ostensive. Ostensive. Similar to the word ostensibly, which means apparently, but maybe not. But it's not the same meaning. Colors are understood ostensibly. You can't explain to somebody what red looks like. You have to, when you teach children about colors, you point to the color red and you go, that's red. And that's blue, and that's green. That's how kids learn color. They're ostensibly understood. They can't be theoretically explained. They have to be experienced to be understood. A lot of times people use this argument whenever they're unable to explain something because they don't really understand it. And so people will get into this to justify without any kind of reason all sorts of things they might believe. Like smoking is good, and you're like, no, it's not. Here's a bunch of research that proves smoking is not good. Like, you just have to experience it to understand it, then you'll know it's good. But actually there's a ton of evidence to say it's not good. And there's a ton of philosophical problems with the idea that smoking is a valuable thing to do with your life. You know who Ayn Rand is? She's the mother of a pseudo-philosophy called objectivism. She wrote a couple books called The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Long a big following. I think in the 30s, something like that, 40s, 50s. Anyway, she was really into smoking. She was like a chain smoker. And she would talk about, the glow of the cigarette is like the bright mind filled with deep thought. And it was like some way she tried to sort of poetically turn her nicotine addiction and her, chimney habit that probably killed her. She probably ended up dying of emphysema or something like that. But she tried to turn it into something sexy and something valuable. Or, big tobacco would, have debates with people about the validity of smoking. And, they're brilliant. I mean, they hire really smart people to defend their thing. And so, and then, of course, the anti-smoking people were just really poor at debate. And so they would say stuff like, there's just something free and American, about smoking. It's a tradition. It might not be the healthiest thing in the world, but it's part of what made America great. Essentially, they just took the Marlboro campaign and tried to explain it philosophically. That they branded cigarettes as being free and cowboy and so on and so forth. They did that. And then they used that as an argument that actually it is that. It's part of our history, it's just, you got to connect. Slavery is also a part of our history. We need to really deeply connect with that and bring it back and, reinstitute it. And so, but yeah, so sometimes you get these just creative, but ultimately poor defenses of various positions that don't really stand up to scrutiny. And so sometimes people, when they have an indefensible position, they'll try to explain to you that it's, you gotta experience it to understand it. Which essentially is a way, if you accept that argument, it's essentially a way of saying, what I say requires no evidence. It requires no justification. I don't have to give you any reasons or any logic. In fact, what I'm saying can be illogical, and there can be a ton of counter evidence against it. But you've accepted my argument that you got to see it to believe it. And therefore, I'm freed from any intellectual responsibility whatsoever. And I can just say any damn nonsense and get away with it because you gave me permission to. There's one, he's passed away, but one Hare Krishna who was kicked out of ISKCON. And he'd get caught lying sometimes. And he would say, Krishna also was very tricky. And then if somebody accepted that he was a guru, he was lying to his disciples and exploiting them. And if somebody accepted that logic of Krishna's real, we kicked him out of the Hare Krishna movement before he got super twisted. Which was a really smart thing for us because eventually got implicated in murder. It was a great thing that we had completely severed our bonds with him legally by the time he got really bad. But anyway, he would say that Krishna is bent in 3 places. Tribhanga Sham Sundar, a name for Krishna is Tribhanga, which means bent in 3 places. And so Krishna's head's bent, his hips are bent, his knees bent. And so it's like his body is kind of like he presents oftentimes in a very seductive pose. And so one of his names is Tribhanga. And so he would say, Krishna is Tribhanga. So I'm also like Krishna. And if his disciples accepted, or if the people he worked with accepted that non-argument, he would then feel free to lie to them again and exploit them some more. You gotta be careful when you let somebody pull a fast one on you and give you some dumb answer because you want to hear it and you don't want to look at the, just the straight truth of it. When you deal with liars, the best thing to do is just to watch what they do. Don't worry about what they say because they're liars. You want to know if they're lying? What do you got to check for? Huh?
Their actions.
No, if you want to know if you want to know if a liar's lying, you know what you got to do to make sure a liar's lying? You got to see if their mouth is moving. And you can assume they're lying. You got it? Like I know you're lying. How did I know? Because you're talking. So I know you're lying. But, a lot of times, there's so many things, but a lot of times liars tell you what you want to hear. And they seemingly lessen the space between where you are and where you want to be. They tell you you're more beautiful than you are. Does my butt look fat in this? You follow? Probably. If you're asking, I'd say there's like a 90% chance it does if you're asking. And then you want the person to say, no, it doesn't look fat. And then you believe that it doesn't look fat. And then why? Because that's way easier than actually losing weight and getting in shape. You find somebody to lie to you and tell you what you want to hear and whisper sweet nothings to you. Like I was wrestling with a friend of mine yesterday, and I have a neck injury and a shoulder injury. So I was working really slowly and methodically and not doing my whole wrestling game. I was crippling my game and just running a very small version of my game. And then the foolish person I was wrestling with was like, hey, I'm doing a lot better than I used to. And I was like, yeah, you've been wrestling lately? And he's like, no. I'm like, you've been working out? And he's like, no, not really. I'm like, yeah, you're probably not doing better than me. I'm probably just only giving you like a small part of my game. And I turned up the heat on him, crushed him underfoot, and was like, does that feel more normal? He's like, oh yeah, that feels like normal. I was like, yeah. It's like, you're not training. You're not stronger, you're not training. But somehow or other you seem to be doing better. Probably because I'm just toying with you, dude. Probably that's what's happening. And then I gotta break out a can of whip ass real quick to check his ego. Right? So we invent all these things we want to be true about ourselves but aren't, and then we find people who will lie to us and tell us that. And it's an exchange. You find people who lie to you and shorten the distance between who you actually are and who you want to be. And they make it seem like you're who you want to be. And they let you forget who you actually are. You follow? And then you pay for that. You pay for that. There's some exploitation, some mutually agreed to con. And there's a relationship between the liar and the liee, where they get something for whispering sweet nothings to you. And so usually you want to accept their terrible logic or non-logic or illogic and their poor arguments and explanations because you're getting something out of the exchange. And so you don't want to look the truth in the face. We got to train ourselves to be truth seekers. We got to teach ourselves to be addicted to the truth. That doesn't mean you got to be Gossip Girl. You can, Marcus Aurelius always said you can always choose to have no opinion. You can choose to not focus on something and not get enmeshed and not form an opinion and not care one way or the other and just stay aloof. That's always an option. But about the important stuff that you are interested in, you need to become addicted to truth. Flatterers. People who flatter you for no reason. They just, oh, you look so good, or oh, you're so amazing, or oh, you're this, or oh, you're that. Flattery is cheap. And so you got to be careful. You see people flattering you, usually it means they're trying to get over on you. I only flatter the children. I only flatter children. And I try not to play into standard tropes, like telling girls you're real pretty and telling boys you're real strong. Usually I'll reverse it. Tell boys they're good looking, tell girls they're strong, something like that. I'll try and subvert it, mix it up, do a little gender confusion for them. I don't think I've ever mentioned this anyway before, but when I would have been 14, maybe 15, and I broke my arm. And the doctor who I saw told me, "Oh, you have really beautiful eyes." Which now, thinking back, it sounds like a sex play. It's like, but I don't think it was. I think they were just looking to say something nice to me, say something encouraging to me, at a vulnerable time in my life. I broke an arm, broke my wrist really badly, had to get surgery, had to get bone graft. It was pretty awful. I think they're trying to, just say something nice and give me a warm fuzzy or something like that. There might be times where that warm fuzzy is valuable. And a lot of times you want to subvert the norm and not give somebody their regular. Give them something different. Give them a different look. Give them something encouraging. Anyway, in general, with the exception of children who do need a lot of attention and love and encouragement for what they can become, and to help them feel like they have value. Sometimes you just get real easy with it. You give them a lot. More than they deserve, more than they've earned. Because they're children, they haven't had time to earn. Children are all, narcissists. It's just the move from childhood to adulthood is the move from being completely self-absorbed to being able to care about others. And so, a child, naturally speaking, is narcissistic and about themselves, but they're developmentally at a stage where that's all they can do because they're just barely starting to have like a larger ability to think of themselves as part of something bigger than themselves. And so they usually tend to be incredibly selfish and self-absorbed. Sometimes you meet adults like that too, who are just developmentally stunted. And because of something that went wrong in their childhood, they're adults, but they behave like children. And you got to diagnose, do they have NPD? Like actually NPD? Not narcissistic tendencies, but do they actually have NPD? A lot of times we'll say, oh, he's a narcissist, she's a narcissist. We mean they have narcissistic tendencies, or right now in their life they're being very self-absorbed. But then there's people who are actually clinically diagnosable as narcissists. And that's a whole different ballgame. That's like the chassis bent. The chassis bent in the car. It's a serious problem. Most of the time when we say somebody's narcissistic, we mean they're self-absorbed or they're petty. Usually if you deal with that person and give them some time and you help them, they grow up. And it's just immaturity. And they need a lot of love. And they need somebody to help raise them up, somebody to be a parent figure to them, somebody to help them grow so they can become more selfless. They grow up. There's a point around 12, 13 in a child's development where they start to form adult relationships, which are characterized by no tit for tat. There's just a general sense in which you don't have to tit for tat everything. The younger age, it's got to be tit for tat. Everything has to be fair. As you develop, you start to find joy just in giving. And you're not keeping track. Obviously, if the person is purely exploitative and if they're always a taker and never a giver, then that cripples the relationship. But it's not that you're keeping track every single day on every single point. That's the move from child relationships to adult relationships. It takes place around 12, 13 years old. Kids can think more abstractly. They can think more from a metacognitive point of view. They can think about thinking. They can think about themselves as part of a much bigger world. So, anyway, to get back to what I was saying, there is some scope for giving kids some just straight flattery encouragement in adult relationships, unless you're dealing with somebody who's incredibly immature and you're essentially taking the role of a parent with them. As much as possible, you want to try to give people legitimate appreciation for something they've actually done and they're good at. I never flatter my gurus. Even in their Vyasa Puja offerings, I'll never flatter them. I never say things about them just like, you are the greatest, most glorious, this, that. I try to think of specific things that they've done for me that I've seen in them that I appreciate. So that it's a real appreciation. That they see I'm paying attention and I'm appreciating them for who they are. And not some caricature, some glorious caricature I've made up in my mind of what they're supposed to be. You guys following this? So in general, we want to speak truth to people. And there's always something you can find to appreciate anybody. And in general, when people flatter you, they're trying to get over on you. That flattery it's not just, it means they got an angle. They're throwing that stuff around because they want to get something from you. So usually when you hear cheap flattery, you should never take it seriously. You should always ask yourself, is that actually true? Are you just saying that? Why are you just saying that? If you take that mentality when you meet flatterers, you'll usually find that they are also deceitful and they're also exploitative. It's a good little inoculation. We should become truth seekers. We should cultivate it. We should want to understand the truth. Doesn't mean we have to get into every single little thing. We can pick and choose what's worth exploring. And when we meet people who are deceitful, we should watch their actions and not their words. Because deceitful people are proven by being deceitful and lying to you that you shouldn't pay attention to their words. You guys following this stuff? All right. So a lot of times, when you catch somebody gaming you, playing you, they'll give you some explanation like, oh, you got to experience it to believe it. Drugs are spiritual. Just got to take them to understand it. And some other such nonsense. People say, oh, the stuff that people will say to justify their horribly thought out worldviews is like sometimes stunning in its stupidity. It's like so stunningly stupid. It's like, you're like, really? Like, are you like, sometimes you think like it's like one of those, Goebbels-esque lies where it's like, they just say it with so much gusto and confidence. You're like, am I like, you like almost feel like you're getting gaslit. You feel like, there must be some truth to this because they're just so like kit and caboodle. So they say it with so much conviction, So when people give you their spiel, you should be fact-checking stuff. You should look at things people say and yourself critically. Most things in the world are not ostensive. They have to be coherent and well presented with evidence. There are a few things in the world which are ostensive. Consciousness is only experienceable in the first person. There's no way for me to prove that you are conscious. I can notice symptoms of consciousness. Theoretically, a robot can be programmed to respond to stimuli the same way you do. Actual evidence of consciousness is experienced in the first person by the individual. It's the ultimate ostensive proof. The natural, automatic, necessary, subjective nature of consciousness gives rise to the philosophical pursuit called phenomenology, which is the attempt to try to legitimize and standardize discussions about things which are fundamentally subjective. Science generally measures things objectively. However, if you study something which is fundamentally subjective, objective analyses of it will automatically be flawed because the very fundamental nature of the thing you're studying is subjective. Therefore, third-party objective descriptions of consciousness will always be lacking the je ne sais quoi, the essence of consciousness, because consciousness is that internal, intimate, movie voiceover in 3 dimensions with taste, sight, touch, smell, and sound, and feelings and emotions and colors and thoughts that goes on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in your head that is so basic to your existence. It's the most undoubtable thing in creation, and yet it is fundamentally subjective. Any attempt to describe it objectively will always be merely symbolic because the essence of the thing you're describing is subjective. Do you guys follow that? But there's other stuff, like colors. like emotions, that require to be experienced to fully be understood. Like sometimes I'll meet somebody who's grieving, maybe like the loss of their child is a classic one for me. Like Ringo Starr, he said, you know the song, It Don't Come Easy? Ringo Starr's greatest hit? That was co-written by George Harrison. It's got the Hare Krishna mantra playing in the background, about halfway through the song. Real subtle, subliminal. Just right after the Beatles broke up in 1970, Ringo Starr put that. Everybody hated Paul McCartney, but the rest of the Beatles got along, so they worked on each other's stuff. And so George Harrison co-wrote that and produced that song for him, which became Ringo Starr's ultimate greatest hit. It still plays on the radio now. It's such a great song. And it's got like a real George Harrison kind of flair to it, real well put together, simple, real well put together. The guitars obviously coming from him. It features Ringo Starr's drum playing. Anyway, so here's a line in that song. It's the first line of the song. I mean, it repeats a few times. You got to pay your dues if you want to sing the blues. Which is just like, it's an epic line. Do you guys know where the blues come from? Where's the blues come from?
South.
Comes from the South. Where specifically in the South?
Mississippi.
The Mississippi Delta, which isn't really a delta. It's an alluvial floodplain. But let's not worry about that too much. It's an alluvial floodplain in between two rivers. Anyway, it's the most fertile soil, practically speaking, on Earth. And so there was tons of slaves, tons of slavery, and that was our country was built on the blood, sweat, and tears of the slaves in the Mississippi Delta. Mississippi, of course, is the most backward state in the U.S. They make Texas look progressive. They make Kentucky look avant-garde. Mississippi is the worst. I mean, I watched a documentary about it. The governor actually had a extrajudicial branch of the government, almost like a paramilitary force that he used in the 60s and 70s to try to stop black people from having civil rights long after the federal government stepped in and did civil rights. And they committed a bunch of murders and covered them up at a state government level and fought with the Fed to protect what they called the Mississippi way of life, which was segregation. And it's like even in the South, they were the most southern state in the South, the South of the South. Anyway, that's where the blues comes from. And so you got to pay your dues if you want to sing the blues. Paying your dues means you have to suffer. So the more you suffer, the more compassionate you can ultimately become. Because the more you can deeply understand other people's suffering. But sometimes I counsel people whose child died. And my opening gambit on that one is, I can't fathom what you're going through. I've lost a brother. I've lost my best friends. I've watched people die. But that one is like, I always got to say, I don't know what you're going through. That's my opening gambit. Because anything less than any attempt to try to empathize with them and say, oh, I know what you're going through, feels really cheap and paltry to me. A lot of times when I talk to people, I really get what they're going through, but that one, I empathize with them. I never want to say, yeah, I understand, I'm with you. Because it just feels like it's an insult. It's a level of suffering that from all the math I can do seems incalculable and incomparable to anything else you might experience in the world. Yeah, suffering leads to compassion. We don't like to talk about that, but if you do it right, suffering leads to compassion, wisdom, hard-earned. Emotions are expensive. That's why sociopaths have a hard time. Because they can study emotions, but they don't really understand them. Sometimes they can cry on cue, but it always kind of doesn't quite fit. If you're trained, you spot the sociopath. It's always like a little, they're picking emotions, picking how to display them. Instead of it being natural and organic. Colors are extensive. There are some things in the world that you have to experience to understand. There are some things like that. Most things are not like that. Most things you should be able to explain. If you can't, probably you're full of it. Probably you're full of it, and probably should go back and spend some more time experiencing life and thinking about it till you can explain it. And don't take the cheap shot out of, you got to experience it to understand it. Don't play that card. And so he plays that card on you, call BS. And force him to step up or shut up. And give evidence and say something coherent. Or be quiet. But you will sometimes encounter things which are, they can only be understood if you've experienced them. And what a second language is like is like that. It's like there's something when it comes with being born into a language and learning it organically from your youngest years and learning how to think, because you don't know how to think, along with learning how to speak. And so you've learned how to think in that language from the very beginning. And it's organic, it's natural. You have a black belt automatically in that language. I mean, the stuff my daughter at the age of 4 comes up with is mind-boggling. She'll be like, cool, no problem. Like, she'll say stuff like that, you know? She'll say, have you heard her? Like, she says like the most ridiculous stuff sometimes. I'm just like, what? And you were watching her it's like what she's saying isn't just parroting. She's learning how to think in language, and you're seeing her, and she's owning those ideas that she's saying. It starts off with imitation, but because she's learning how to think along with it, and so it's like really sharp. Her knowledge of English, even at the age of 4, is so intimate. Somebody can spend 50 years studying English as from the age of 20 to the age of 70. And they still wouldn't quite get it the way she gets it at the age of 4. So anyway, English is the second language problem. And that means that, sometimes he would say stuff that, he only had a limited vocabulary in English. And so he'd use whatever term he had. Like sometimes you talk about codes. But at some point he learned the word aphorism. And so he started using the word aphorism instead of code. And aphorism is a short, tight, concise statement that packs a wall philosophically. And once Prabhupada learned that term, he began using that term. But prior, he used the word code, which is a much less specific term than aphorism. It's not a bad choice if you don't know the word aphorism. But once you know that word, it's like it exactly fits the thing you're describing. You follow? So, when I meet devotees for whom English is a second language, it's sometimes their lack of English as a native tongue gives rise to a special perspective on the language because they are learning it academically and intellectually and not just the way a child learns it. So like when I think of the word disintegrate, I think of Star Trek and ray guns and lasers that disintegrate things. But the word literally means to become disintegrated, to lose your integration. You follow? And so Prabhupada would use the term disintegrate in that literal sense, which kind of blew my mind when I noticed it. Or Prabhupada would say stuff like, you should surrender to Krishna without reservation. And I remember a friend of mine, a sannyasi, very great devotee. In his whole village growing up, no one ever ate meat. His whole village. There was no alcohol in his village either. In fact, he, from reading comic books, thought alcohol was like some black, noxious substance with like smoke coming off of it. And so he met the devotees, joined the temple. He's a big Sanskrit pundit also. He joined the temple. His brother also was a sannyasi. They're both lifelong brahmacharis. Never had sex their whole life. Lifelong brahmacharis. Both big Sanskrit pundits. Super humble, incredibly great souls. And so he joined the Hare Krishna movement, and he would go out and do outreach work in Mumbai. And he told me the first time he ever saw alcohol, he went to somebody's house and they offered him some hot milk with some masala in it. But they were drinking some like nimbu pani or some like green drink. Like a green translucent drink, like krush juice or something like that. And he remembers thinking, the person was like, oh, I'm so fallen, please forgive. And they gave him a big donation. But he remembers thinking, oh, I'd rather have that juice. How come he's only giving me this milk? And at some point he realized it was alcohol. And he was so surprised because it looked just like juice. Like some lemon juice, some lemonade. He was so surprised because his whole life he thought of alcohol as being this, like 3 X's and like smoke coming off of it. So then he was giving class in Laguna one day, and he said, yes, we should surrender Krishna without reservation. Just like when you go to stay at a hotel, you make a reservation ahead of time to give yourself some guarantee and some confidence and some stability. Like when we would do padayatra, he was on padayatra for years, we had an advanced party and they would go make a reservation at the school so our party could stay there at night as we were traveling. It was very important. They used to have to run ahead or take a bicycle and ride ahead. Eventually we got them a moped so they could zip off and then they could really do the nice advanced party work. Otherwise like running ahead of us, trying to get to where we're going first. But he said, but we should not be like that with Krishna. We should just in a very pure way just show up for Krishna and trust him and not worry about making a reservation. You follow? And I was like, wow, like what a brilliant understanding of without reservation. Also, Prabhupada used to speak of unalloyed bhakti. Unalloyed bhakti. Well, you alloy metals. You mix metals with a certain amount of steel to make it more sturdy. And so you alloy metals to make them more sturdy and heat resistant and et cetera, et cetera. But unalloyed bhakti is if you have a pure metal, which is unalloyed. It has no other cheaper metals to stabilize it mixed in with it. So, for instance, 14 karat gold, which I don't consider gold. Like if you look at something which is gold-plated, it has a real cheap look to it. Like silver gold-plated, it looks cheap. And then as time goes on, it looks even cheaper. And they have gold-filled, which is another version of gold plating. That's also looks cheap. 14 karat gold also looks cheap. Because there's a bunch of zinc and silver and whatever else in there. 24 karat gold is this like incredible yellow color. It's actually more gold than you would think. It's more yellow, and it's so gold. You're like, whoa. 22 carats like that too. 24 carats, even more. 18 carats okay, but it's, you starting to lose that. Just that incredible gold color. Again, it's extensive. You have to actually see it. It's like pure yellow. It's also soft. 24 karat gold, you can if you have a bangle, you just bend it. It's no problem. You can bend it, no problem. It's easy to bend. They can't really make rings out of 22 karat gold because they just bend so easy. They have to make them out of 18. So, unalloyed devotion. Pure. Nothing else. No personal desires. No desire even for liberation. You want nothing from Krishna. You just want to love Krishna. Your devotion is pure. It's not mixed with anything selfish, with anything secondary, with anything extra. Prabhupada would explain unalloyed devotion like that. Because he understood the idea of alloying metals and what unalloyed. So, although English as a second language is always a rough fit, and, as they say, no matter how well trained, the tumbler's son always walked a little crooked. You grow up and your father's like a tumbler in a circus, then from a young age you're learning how to do somersaults and such, and you never quite just learn how to walk straight because that bend is always natural to you. It's like uncrooking a dog's tail. It's natural. So, no matter how well trained, we think in our mother tongue. And even when we think in another language, I've thought in Spanish before. In my life, I lived in Mexico for a while, so I thought in Spanish. I lived with Mexican devotees in Mexico, and I started thinking in Spanish, started dreaming in Spanish. But I was a lot stupider because I couldn't express myself as well, and I couldn't think as well. And so your native tongue, you know intimately. But when you meet people who have learned your language as an adult, sometimes they bring a certain piercing ability to analyze words that you skip over because you learn them by imitation. And they became part of the way you look at the world and you didn't question it. I gave you a few examples. Surrendering to Krishna without reservation, unalloyed devotion. I disintegrate. I gave you a few examples. Anyway, there is a verse in the Gita which I have always appreciated. And what I appreciate is Prabhupada's translation of it into English. Well, Dyutam Chalayatam Asmi. Of cheating, I am gambling. This is Krishna saying he's the essence of all things. Tejas Vinamaham. Of I am the power of the powerful. Jayasmi. I am victory. Vyavasaya Smi. I am resolve or determination. Sattvam Sattvatamaham. I am the existence of everything which exists. Did you guys follow that? That's a straight translation. I don't want to get into gambling and cheating and why would Krishna identify himself with negative things. He also identifies himself with death. Mrityu Sarva Harashchaham, I am death, which takes everything away. He identifies himself with good, bad, and ugly things in the world. What he's trying to do is show that within any category of existence, he is that essence that makes up that existence. It doesn't literally mean that like you should go and gamble. It just means that the ultimate essence of cheating is gambling. And so Krishna's identifying himself with the fundamental core of all existence. He also says amongst means of curbing lawlessness, he's the stick. Because what's the ultimate way you stop somebody from doing something wrong? You physically stop them. That's why police officers carry guns. Is because ultimately, police officers will force you to comply. They won't argue with you and explain it to you and reason with you. At some point, they'll tackle you or even shoot you. It's the essence of how to control something, is to physically control it. That doesn't mean Krishna's supporting domestic violence. You follow? But it does mean he's trying to look at the world and help you see that the core of all things exists. And he's showing you the core of everything that exists. And you got to figure out a way to not do that in a negative light. That's not what we're doing today. Here's the statement. And of the splendid I am the splendor, which is actually like a beautiful, I am the splendor of all splendorous things, I would say. But Krishna says, I am the splendor of the splendid, which I thought was a particularly insightful way to say it in English. I wouldn't have said it like that. You follow? I would have said, I'm the splendor of all things filled with splendor, or splendorous, maybe, if I was sharp. But here Prabhupada says, I'm the splendor of the splendid. Also, tejas is means power, force. So I wouldn't have done the splendor thing either. So that's what I think. But the thing is, tejas means power, force, but it also means light. And so splendor and splendid is, the word splendor in English kind of also means light, and it also means power, which is sort of what the word tejas means in Sanskrit. And so it kind of is a perfect translation in English. The splendor of the splendid. It's very poetic. But here's the big one. And of the splendid, I am the splendor. I am victory. I am adventure. I am adventure. And I am the strength of the strong. That translation of Vyavyasayo Smi, I am determination. Vyavasai means determination, resolve, fortitude, conviction. Prabhupada generally translates the word like this, even in the Gita. But in this particular section, he says, I am adventure. And I always beyond now we can try to justify that translation. The hero's journey to do something great, to do something amazing, to have an adventure. What do you require? You require to have some resolve. And the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. You got to have enough conviction, enough excitement to go for it and to really do something meritorious. You can't just be a dabbler or a dilettante. You got to actually go for it and get sunk in. And so resolve is critical to adventure. It's critical to doing something amazing. It's perhaps commitment is the most essential feature of all great things that occur in life. We should cultivate commitment. We should become expert people at committing. We should learn the lost art and science of how to make a promise and keep it. We should be the opposite of a con artist, deceitful, duplicit person. Sarlata Vaishnavata. Prabhupada's guru used to say that simplicity is Vaishnavism. Simplicity, one. Duplicity, two. There should be no difference between our inside and our outside. I was explaining this to somebody today, and I was explaining to a person who tends to get angry and frustrated, and they were saying to me, we're supposed to be humble. And I said, yeah, but you're not humble. You're not humble. You're just quiet. Being quiet while you boil inside is not being humble. I go, a great step forward for you in your life is to learn how to clearly articulate your feelings so they don't boil over in you. And that's humility, because you're being honest with where you're at. And that opens the door, makes you vulnerable, allows people to engage with you. If you're wrong or you're wrong-headed about something, it makes you vulnerable because you have to justify your position and why you feel like you do. And if it turns out you were off, then somebody's going to point it out to you, and you're going to have to own it and reconstruct how you think about the world. And it becomes cognitive therapy with a reframing of your worldview. But you need to learn the art of just speaking your piece and being honest with where you're at and being vulnerable and taking a chance and being open. That's the beginning of humility. Do you guys follow that? Humility doesn't mean you're like an envious rascal in your heart, but you just don't say anything. So anyway, we should be simple. We should cultivate the ability to make a promise and keep it. We should be guileless. Even before we're pure, we should be pure in the sense that we're straightforward people. We should cultivate that. Without that, it's impossible to hold grace. The cup's too small. Can't hold grace. When you become capable of committing, that becomes the beginning of deep relationships, of profound relationships, lifelong relationships, and a relationship with Krishna as well, and an adventurous life, a miraculous life, a life filled with meaning. So Prabhupada's rendition of, I am resolve, I am conviction, I am determination, as I am adventure. Prabhupada's really taking it to the next level of what the result of that resolve is that you have the most adventurous life. You follow? And I was just reflecting on how first of all, it's just such a brilliant translation from Prabhupada. And that's my thoughts about why Prabhupada rendered it like that. And that's just something about English as a second language. And that's something about the kind of insight that you actually get from having a second language. And where there is this particular insight you get that might escape even the native speakers because you're forced to look at the meanings of words and word stems and stuff like that. You notice, the literal meaning of a word sometimes more than the colloquial meaning, which you'll get as a native speaker very easily. And then that made me think of, how language, to really appreciate what it's like to learn a second language, you have to do it. And I talk about a sense of philosophy. I gave examples of color. Then I thought about how people use this as a cheap excuse to stop themselves from thinking logically or being able to give evidence. And so I spent time with that. And then I got into why do people do that? Because they're duplicit and they're trying to get over on you. And so you have to become a watchdog for that. And something about how to stop participating in a lie game and become a true seeker. And why people buy into the sweet nothings, because they want to believe something about themselves that isn't true yet. And they want to put the time in. I gave you an example from my friend and I who wrestled yesterday. And then we brought it back to where I ultimately wanted to go. I think Krishna is an amazing, adventurous life. I think pursuing Krishna in this lifetime as your goal is the best thing you can possibly do. I don't think being a doctor and a lawyer is all that cool. I don't think being a model is all that cool. when I think about loving Krishna and the fulfillment that comes from loving Krishna and the purpose in life and the insight and the wisdom and the joy and the miracle that comes from dedicating your life to that, everything else seems really paltry and really small. That doesn't mean you have to keep body and soul together. Sure, you gotta do something to make money, get your chapatis. No problem. I'm not anti, work. But, it's funny. It's like, if you in India, a lot of times, if your train breaks down or something like that, or if you see people who are, on a bus tour or something like that, the bus will pull over and the women will just break out a tawa and build a fire and start whipping up some chapatis on the fire. It's incredible sometimes. You see people just cooking chapatis, whip up a dough, roll them out, bang them out real quick. I see the same thing with the Mexican workers, around. Lunchtime comes around, they'll whip up some corn tortillas on the spot. You ever seen that? Just cook them up with a hot little cooker with it. You just figure it out. Because it's just a meal means fresh hot corn tortillas. And so just they whatever else is going on the side of the road, Laguna Beach or wherever, they'll just whip up a little cooker in their truck and figure out a way to heat up some corn. You ever notice this?
I haven't seen that.
You're too bougie. You know what I'm talking about? You see it on the street, right? You're not on the street, girl. That's the problem. You know what I'm talking about, Matt?
Yeah, kinda.
No?
I've already seen them make tortillas, but I've seen them,
You know what I'm talking about?
stands and all that.
Have you seen it? It's totally standard. Totally standard. It's totally normal. Laborers will go out, they'll work, lunchtime comes around, they whip up some tortillas. Anyway, chapatis, tortillas, whatever. You gotta get your sustenance. That should be our side gig. Our job should be our side gig. Our life should be seeking truth. And the ultimate truth is Krishna. The embodiment of all truth. The personification of truth. The personification of love, which is the ultimate manifestation of truth. That's a life worth living. That's an adventurous life. That's what we should all be doing with our lives. We should all have a black belt in pursuing Krishna, in pursuing truth. We should all have a black belt in committing to that. And that's an adventurous life. And so when I read this, I am adventure, I think, what an adventurous life I've had. I got to travel all over the world, in 43 countries before I was 24. That was adventurous. But that's nothing compared to my internal adventure. The adventure from chanting japa with a vow. The adventure from following rules of integrity. The adventure from dedicating myself to truth and purity enough that our sacred texts open up, that the holy name opens up. That's the real adventure. I remember when I was a kid, there was a game on Atari called Adventure that I used to play as a kid. The name of the game was Adventure. And it was there were dragons and castles and a ring, I think, that you got ultimately. It was a way to beat the game. It was a red dragon, a white dragon, I think a gold dragon. Maybe one other color, I can't remember. But yeah, it was castles you had to go to and things you had to get from each castle and put all together. And then you won the game. There was little secrets in the game that were just passed on by word of mouth. That were not, as part of the game you would ever get from playing it a billion times. But the makers of the game put those secrets into it that you could find out. And it was just passed on all through the country by word of mouth. Because there was no, internet to look all this stuff up. But I remember when I first playing that game and like thinking, this is amazing. Like, wow, what a game. And I was like, it's like other world I could just sport myself into. And I think people probably like when they read Harry Potter books, they had a similar experience, like this alternate world that you could just dive into and just sport yourself and leave this world and just, almost in some ways transcend the reality of your existence. And I think mythology was that for people, also, traditionally. Krishna's that. All that. And more. Krishna's the real version of that, not the pretend version. And the pursuit of Krishna is the ultimate adventure of all lifetimes, of unlimited lifetimes. We shouldn't cheat ourselves with that. To argue with people we don't know and look at pictures of cats. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Thank you very much, IGTV. Thank you very much, Facebook.